Snow fell silently over the Whitmore mansion that Christmas Eve, reflecting the golden lights that spilled through the windows. Inside, a cozy warmth hid uncomfortable secrets. Richard Whitmore, a millionaire accustomed to shaping the world around him, gazed at the illuminated tree while holding a glass of wine. The room was filled with expensive perfumes, restrained laughter, and the discreet clink of silverware. Then, with a calculated look and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he called the waitress. The order he was about to make wasn't just unusual, it was fraught with something bordering on the forbidden. And what he didn't know was that, just a few feet away, behind a half-open door, his wife watched, her heart beating in a rhythm of ice and fire, about to hear words that would change everything. The silence following the request echoed louder than any Christmas carol. The maid, confused and visibly embarrassed, cast a quick glance toward the hallway, as if searching for an invisible exit. Across the way, his wife, her hands trembling, felt a wave of disbelief and anger rise through her. It wasn't just what he'd said, it was the way he'd said it, as if testing boundaries, as if desire could be disguised as festive whimsy. The scent of pine and cinnamon mingled with the bitter taste rising in her mouth. She took a step back, knowing that from that moment on, nothing in the Whitmore house would be the same. And as the tree lights flickered, the invisible gears of fate began to turn, setting the stage for a Christmas that would end in poetic justice. If you don't want to miss my videos, leave your like on the video and subscribe to the channel to continue watching our videos. The night seemed hand-painted, as if each snowflake had been carefully placed to create the perfect setting. The Whitmore mansion stood imposingly above the white lawn, its windows casting warm reflections that contrasted with the biting cold outside. Inside, the atmosphere was one of almost suffocating elegance. Persian rugs cushioned footsteps, velvet curtains blocked the wind, and fireplaces crackled as if fueled by ancient secrets. The dinner guests hadn't yet arrived, but the house was already filled with a dense atmosphere, as if the air were charged with something unspoken. Richard Whitmore stood beside the enormous Christmas tree, its golden ornaments reflecting his face with firm features and calculating eyes. He wore an impeccable suit, but there was something about his posture, the way he held his wineglass, the measured smile, that betrayed more than just a host awaiting the evening. Every gesture seemed studied, as if preparing a calculated move in a game whose rules only he understood. Across the room, the maid, Maria, worked in silence. Her steps were light, but carried an invisible weight. Since arriving at this house, she had learned to avoid direct gazes, to speak only when necessary. It wasn't that Richard was hostile. On the contrary, he knew how to be polite. But there was a kind of attentiveness about him that wasn't neutral. And that night, more than ever, Maria sensed something was about to happen. Upstairs, Elizabeth, Richard's wife, was observing some of the activity. She was slowly dressing for dinner, but her thoughts weren't on her choice of necklace or lipstick. She knew her husband better than anyone. She could tell when his silences concealed strategies and when his gestures were accompanied by hidden intentions. Hearing footsteps echoing down the hallway, she descended a few steps, curious, until she stopped in the shadows, where she could see without being seen. Richard placed his glass on the side table, dabbed his lips with his handkerchief, and called Maria in a soft, almost intimate voice. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken to her differently from the other employees, but tonight there was something new, an almost palpable tension. The tree flickered behind him, as if silently witnessing what was to come. Elizabeth leaned forward instinctively, as if sensing she was about to hear something that couldn't be ignored. The Whitmore mansion was more than a house. It was a monument to expensive silence. Every detail seemed to scream wealth, yet restrained, as if even luxury needed to maintain its poise. The white marble of the main hall reflected the soft light of crystal chandeliers, which hung like waterfalls frozen in time. In the living room, a massive fireplace projected lazily dancing. Flames, spreading a welcoming warmth but unable to quell the coldness lurking in the darkest corners of the house. The walls were adorned with original artwork, family heirlooms, and exclusive auction acquisitions. Gilded paintings watched the life unfold within, like silent witnesses to untold stories. Crimson velvet curtains blocked the street view, creating the feeling of a world apart, isolated from any reality not shaped by Richard Whitmore's money and influence. Maria, as she discreetly arranged the silverware on the dining table, realized the weight of this luxury. It wasn't just the grandeur of the objects, but the way everything seemed to demand that she move carefully, almost apologizing for being there. The impeccable linen tablecloth, the crystal glasses so fine they seemed too fragile to touch, and the delicate aroma wafting from the kitchen, a blend of roast turkey and rare spices, all composed a symphony of calculated excess. Richard walked through the space as if he were the conductor of this silent orchestra. His steps were firm but unhurried. His eyes roamed every corner, not to admire, but to control. It was as if everything was exactly where it should be because he had determined it to be, and any deviation, no matter how small, would shatter the balance that sustained his domestic reign. Elizabeth, still positioned at the vantage point where she could observed this choreography with the same mixture of fascination and apprehension she had always felt for her husband. She knew his meticulous attention, which wasn't limited to household objects. Richard applied the same gaze to people, sizing them up, weighing their gestures and responses, as if each interaction were part of a larger game. The muffled sound of snow falling outside contrasted with the silence inside, broken only by the soft clink of glasses and plates as Maria set the table. Elizabeth felt a shiver run down her spine, and it wasn't just from the chill escaping through the cracks in the ancient windows. Something about the night held a different weight, a density that announced the meticulous balance of the house was about to be disturbed. And then, just as Maria bent to adjust a candle, Richard approached with a barely perceptible smile. There was no need for him to say anything at that moment. The simple gesture of stopping beside her carried a tension that Elizabeth felt from across the room, as if it had reached her through the air, shrouded in a silence that felt like a warning. Richard had cultivated the perfect image for an America that admired winners. In the society pages, he was the benefactor who funded neighborhood libraries and winter concerts. In the Whitmore Foundation's annual reports, he appeared as the man who believed in the power of second chances. But anyone who observed him closely would realize that his good deeds were always tied to invisible strings. He called it reciprocity. Elizabeth called it control. From an early age, he had learned from his father that people are like safes. Some hold money, others guard doors, and he collected keys. It was with this mindset that, years before, he had hired Maria when her life had been torn in two by overdue bills and an unforgiving winter. The salary was fair, the room in the annex was heated, and the refrigerator was always full. In return, Richard mentally noted every gesture of gratitude. He had helped cover expensive treatment for a relative, discreetly donated to the church he attended, recommended his brother for a temporary job in hotel maintenance. None of this was selfless. In his mind, everything was a balance of emotional credits and debits, an invisible ledger whose closing would happen when he chose. Elizabeth had witnessed this pattern countless times. At a fall gala, she saw Richard promise a sponsorship to a young violinist, and weeks later charge him with a strategic dinner appearance to impress a classical music-loving investor. One spring, he financed the courts for a community center. That summer, he demanded the right photo, the right speech, the right-sized bronze plaque. Over time, Elizabeth came to recognize that metallic glint in his eyes when a favor was granted. It wasn't compassion, it was calculation. Still, she remained by his side, clinging to the hope that somewhere the man she loved was still breathing beneath the layers of strategy. That Christmas Eve, as the fireplace crackled slowly, everything that defined Richard seemed to come together beneath the tree lights. The expensive wine, the Swiss watch discreetly displayed on his wrist, the way he knew the name of every supplier, every florist, every waiter who would arrive later, not out of empathy, but because names are also levers. Maria felt this like someone sensing a current beneath the calm surface of a lake. Her gratitude for the job and the help she received was mixed with a tense respect, almost fear, for this man who always seemed one step ahead of anyone's needs. There was, however, one story the mansion didn't tell in its paintings: the day Elizabeth years ago faced the first great silence of her marriage. That was when she discovered an exchange of messages between Richard and an art curator, nothing explicit but full of innuendo and belated invitations. He swore it was nothing more than useful flirting, untimely networking, and promised limits. Elizabeth forgave him, but her trust dwindled to the size of a shard of glass. It still shone, but cut at the slightest touch. Since then, she'd become an expert at deciphering her husband's micro-gestures. She knew when he was preparing the ground for a proposal, and when he was merely toying with the edge of the abyss. That late afternoon, his body seemed inclined toward the edge. The discreet smile, the lowered voice, the calculated pause before pronouncing Maria's name, signals that, together, formed the same dangerous constellation Elizabeth had learned to recognize and fear. And then there was the calendar. Richard liked symbolic dates. At Christmas, his generosity became grandiose performance, and performances always need vulnerable protagonists. The old radio in the kitchen played a barely audible jazz standard, and the scent of butter and nutmeg wafted through in gentle waves. Maria straightened the hem of her apron, wiped her hands, and took a deep breath before answering the call. For a moment, her eyes met Elizabeth's, up at the top of the stairs, a fleeting reflection in the glass of the hallway door. There was no exchange of words, just a silent vibration like the warning contained in a flash of lightning that refuses to turn into thunder. Richard moved 2 steps, enough to reduce their world to a triangle of light beneath the glow of the tree. He spoke of effort, of trust, of the family that the house had become for everyone there. His words were wrapped like an expensive gift, but within them lay the dry crack of a condition. Maria, her heart racing, felt that this conversation wasn't a conversation at all. It was a paperless contract. Elizabeth, motionless, realized that her husband had once again reached the point where a favor requires repayment. And with this realization, something in her hardened, silent and cold, like the ice that forms on a windowsill at dawn. The request had not yet been spoken, but it already weighed heavily on the Persian rug, like a shadow that needed no body to exist. Maria had learned early on to recognize the dangers that don't raise their voices. In the restaurant where she worked when she first arrived in the country, it was the customers who smiled too much and left large tips in exchange for small favors. At Whitmore, it was the elegant silence that shaped intentions. Her gaze wasn't confrontational, it was reading. She noticed the half-second delay in Richard's response, the way he set his glass on the sideboard before speaking to her, the slight lowering of his tone that transformed any sentence into a confidence. She carried within her a wisdom acquired between long shifts and cold buses, a radar that kept her together where others broke. There were days when she thought of her mother, far away, storing photographs in a shoebox. There were days when she remembered her father's advice, said patiently, "Grown-ups make mistakes too, my dear, and when they make mistakes with little ones, the world finds a way to turn around." She never forgot that verb, to turn. That night, with her apron clean and her hands still smelling of nutmeg, Maria positioned herself a step beside the tree, in one of those corners where the light is soft and the person's image is captured entirely by the cameras in the room. She knew, by necessity, the geography of safe places. Richard approached with the same calm he would use to select a rare wine. There was a borrowed tenderness in his smile, as if each word were wrapped in gold foil to disguise its weight. Maria, inside, turned on a light, not the paralyzing warning light, but the one that reveals her own posture. She straightened her shoulders, cleared her throat, felt the soft carpet support her body, as if signing its own presence. She spoke little, but observed a lot. She knew of the expensive coats that arrived by delivery on Saturdays, the flowers exchanged when a business deal required perfume, the extra glasses Richard poured himself when a plan required liquid courage. She also knew of Elizabeth's quiet way of carrying the marriage, measuring distances with her eyes so no one could understand the ruler. Maria respected that woman who, even surrounded by everything, always seemed close to losing something. Perhaps that was why she felt a breath, a presence contained in the dimness of the staircase, like a thought taking shape silently. She didn't turn her face, but softened her voice, as if speaking so that two people could hear without either being exposed. When Richard said her name, time fragmented into details: the candle flame that tilted, the music that changed chords, the crystal that multiplied the tree's glow. He began with compliments, competence, trust, part of the family, and Maria, with a nearly invisible nod, thanked him without accepting the trap. Compliments like that usually ask for an open door. She kept her hands together, without interlacing her fingers, like someone learning to say no with their body before searching for words. Deep down, Maria's courage came. Not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of limits. She had debts to pay, yes, small dreams, and the haste of those who depend on the next shift, but she also had the dignity that accepts no interest. She sensed the contours of the request before it was made, like someone sensing the shift in the wind before the snow. Richard used Christmas as a stage. He spoke of gratitude, of a spirit of togetherness, of something special that would make the night unforgettable. Maria nodded, listening to every syllable like someone measuring grains on a scale. There was a line on the ground, invisible to those who had never crossed it. She saw it clearly. If she stepped beyond it, she would lose a part of herself that no paycheck could ever return. So she smiled slightly, that smile that promises nothing, and returned the most neutral sentence she could muster. "Whatever you need for the house to be peaceful, I'll do it." The word house wasn't random. It was a reminder. There were rules, spaces, relationships that don't get confused. The man inclined his head, evaluating her answer as if tasting a wine he hadn't yet decided was good. Maria kept her gaze level with his chin, neither submissive nor defiant, just presence. And in that simple gesture she sewed a line in the air. The corridor breathed along with it. Elizabeth, in the shadows, felt the coldness in her chest give way to another kind of warmth, a spark of recognition. Someone there, without saying it, was defending what she herself had been allowing to be lost. Maria didn't know it, but in that second she had become a mirror, and mirrors have the gift of giving back to others what they no longer see. When the living room clock struck the hour with a deep chime, Richard licked his lips, as if preparing to cross a threshold with his usual practiced elegance. Maria took a deep breath, adjusted a candle, and made sure the flame straightened. Small gestures sustain great falls. The proposal would come. She was ready not to accept it, but to name the night with the right word. And as the lights flickered, a certainty descended like snow. Try as they might, no one would erase the outline of the right things. Elizabeth hadn't intended to listen, at least not so directly. She descended a few steps just to feel the heat rising from the hall, perhaps to grab a glass of wine before finishing her preparations. But when Richard's voice changed tone, something made her pause. It was lower, more intimate, as if he were speaking to someone who shouldn't repeat his words. She stood still, leaning against the banister, the wood cool beneath her fingers. The hallway behind her was dark, the only light coming from the tree below, casting shadows that moved across the high ceiling. The words came fragmented, interrupted by small gestures she recognized from afar. Richard always paused before something he considered important, as if silence were part of the negotiation. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment just to confirm she wasn't imagining it. It was his voice, sweet on the surface, but with that hidden weight that only those who have known him for years can identify. A weight that doesn't ask, but insinuates, that doesn't threaten, but places the other person before an invisible debt. With each sentence, she felt a tide rise within her. It wasn't exactly jealousy, though there was a shadow of it, but a kind of indignation that couldn't be contained within her chest. Richard had a habit of walking the line between generosity and possession, and tonight he seemed ready to cross that line. Elizabeth breathed slowly, afraid that any noise would betray her presence. Maria, below, responded cautiously. Her voice didn't tremble, but held a measured care like someone treading on thin ice. Elizabeth sensed dignity there, and perhaps that was the reason Richard persisted. the challenge of bending those who don't bend easily. It made something burn in the depths of her eyes. It wasn't just about Maria, it was about herself, about all the times she'd accepted the game, believing she could control it later. The music on the radio in the kitchen shifted to a Christmas classic, the melody filling the space like a curtain. Richard took advantage of this transition to lean slightly toward the maid. Elizabeth couldn't see his lips clearly, but she knew the exact moment of the proposal was approaching. His body had a language she knew better than any other. The slight shift of his weight to his left leg, the almost imperceptible turn of his shoulder, the tilt of his head as if closing the distance without intruding. Gripping the railing tighter, she felt the wood give slightly under the pressure of her fingers. Blood rushed to her face, but she forced herself to stay where she was. Part of her wanted to climb down and interrupt, to put a period before the sentence was complete. Another part, quieter and more calculating, preferred to listen to the end, to collect every word as evidence, not for a court of law, but for the inevitable judgment she would make later, the one that uses no judges, only consequences. From her spot on the stairs, she saw only fragments: Maria's hand gripping the edge of the table, the golden reflection of her hair in the light from the tree, Richard's face in profile, lit to highlight a smile that, to those unfamiliar with him, would seem generous. Elizabeth knew it was no innocent smile. It was the same one he had used to convince a business rival to sell him a property for less than its true value, a smile that always came before someone lost something. And then, as if fate had chosen the moment of maximum tension, Richard said something Elizabeth couldn't quite hear, only fragments, words that on their own carried weight. Just between us, something special, tonight. The rest was lost in the clink of a glass that Maria moved aside. But it was enough. Elizabeth felt the ground beneath her feet shift, not because it had given way, but because it was no longer the same as before. And while downstairs the two adjusted the candle on the table, upstairs a silent decision was being born. Richard let a calculated silence fill the air before advancing. It wasn't the silence of someone hesitant, but of someone preparing the groundwork for each word to sound inevitable. He moved just close enough for Maria to smell the woody perfume he wore on occasions when he wanted to make a statement. His eyes wandered over the tree, the glow of the lights reflected in the glass of the glasses, as if to reinforce the intimate atmosphere, a private Christmas within the official Christmas. "Maria," he began, his tone a mix of appreciation and gravity, "you know how important you are to this house. I'm not just talking about work, I'm talking about trust." He let the sentence float, watching her react. Maria didn't look away, but maintained the posture of someone listening attentively without committing. Richard took another step, enough to enter the zone where words stop being mere sounds and begin to carry intention. "Tonight is special. I want to ask you something that isn't part of your job description, but that means a lot to me." He spoke slowly, with pauses that seemed to measure the temperature of the air between them. "I need you to take care of something discreetly." The word discreet hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Maria felt the weight of it, but didn't move. He continued, evading the real meaning with memorized phrases. "It's nothing wrong, just something that needs to stay between us. A gift, but not for dinner." He gave a half smile, as if suggesting there's a hidden code in the words. "I want you to be with me when the guests leave. There's something I need to show you, away from everyone." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The way he'd said, "away from everyone," left no room for naivete. It was a sentence that didn't need to be finished, to be understood. Even so, she kept her face serene, sustaining the silence that was now hers, a silence that said more than any answer. Elizabeth, on the stairs, felt her heart race as she heard enough to understand the meaning, even without all the words. It was the kind of request that isn't spoken aloud in the middle of a brightly lit room, but that changes the dynamic between two people forever. A flame of indignation and coldness ignited within her. More than the potential betrayal, it was the audacity that hurt her, the fact that Richard felt confident enough to speak like that, in his own home as if he were untouchable. Richard, noticing Maria wasn't responding immediately, inclined his head slightly and softened his tone. "Think of it as a personal favor, something only you can do for me." And then, almost as if rehearsed, he lightly touched her arm, a quick gesture, but intimate enough to further bridge the distance. Maria didn't back down, but she didn't give in either. Her body remained firm, her eyes focused not on his face but on the reflection of the tree in the background. It was her way of reminding herself that, even at this moment, there were still lights greater than any shadow. In a calm voice he replied, "I can think about it, sir, but right now we still have much to prepare for supper." Richard smiled, not as if he had been served, but as if he felt the seed had been planted. He withdrew a step, satisfied with what he believed to be an implicit agreement. At the top of the stairs, Elizabeth took a deep breath, absorbing every detail, his tone, her posture, her restrained gesture. And in that instant, she realized she needed no further confirmation. What had begun as an incidental eavesdropping had now become a silent mission. There followed a pause of noiseless gestures, but they pushed the night into a place difficult to return to. The living room clock struck the hours with a deeper sound than usual, and each chime seemed to carve a little deeper into the void between people. Maria walked from the kitchen to the living room with the precision of someone learning to breathe inside aquariums, adjusting candles, checking cutlery, lifting and setting down glasses, as if sculpting silence. There was no retreat, only presence. Passing the hallway mirror, she saw a tree ornament reflected like a golden tear. For a second, it seemed as if Christmas itself was weeping softly, unnoticed. Richard interpreted the stillness as ground. Gained. It was his old illusion, mistaking caution for acceptance, neutrality for consent. He moved around the room again with the studied ease of a host, leaving pleasant comments hanging in the air, as if decorating a stage. She asked about the wine, commented on the roast, rearranged a napkin just to have an excuse to be 2 feet away from Maria once more. All the approaches were disguised as kindness, and precisely for that reason, they hurt more. At the top of the stairs, Elizabeth finished, breathing out the decision that had been born minutes before. She descended slowly, as if measuring the floor before stepping, her eyes silently scanning the room. Her face bore the serenity achieved when love no longer needs to prove anything to survive. No one immediately noticed the subtle shift in gravity in the room, but the rooms felt it. The head chair seemed taller, the chandelier hung like an oath, the fireplace collapsed, an ember on the rug, and the ember died without daring to burn. The doorbell rang, and the changed air had to learn to smile. The first guests brought scents of wet wool and polite laughter, shaking the snow from their collars. Hugs were replicated, photos with the tree, toasts were made in advance. Richard glided to the door with perfect cordiality, and the social choreography began. Maria, in the background, became the line that kept the score in time. She greeted, served, collected, and with each gesture she established an invisible boundary that prevented Richard from crossing. Elizabeth fulfilled the role the world knew, kissing guests, complimenting the decor, small comments about trips and projects. But there was something new in her eyes, a winter glow that can't be extinguished by fireplaces. When he met Maria's gaze, the exchange was minimal and complete, the recognition of 2 women who coincided at the same point on the curve. Conversations scattered in islands. The investor, who always talked loudly, occupied the favorite chair. The neighbor brought an oversized dessert and a ready opinion on any subject. A young couple asked for a selfie with the tree. Beneath the conversations, an underground river flowed. Richard, attentive to the tides, seemed to be waiting for the night to hand him the exact moment to push Maria away under some elegant pretext. But the house, complicit in both, began to create small delays. A lamplight flickered as he rehearsed a call. A serving dish required 2 hands the moment he opened his mouth. A guest grabbed his elbow to tell a joke just as the sentence was about to be born. Fate, when it decides, is meticulous. Maria, without planning, began to occupy the places that prevented the shadow from closing in. She placed a flower arrangement in the passage Richard would likely use, rearranged bottles on a sideboard that required another path, always maintaining a distance where her dignity could breathe. Elizabeth, for her part, began to talk about the future with those who needed to listen. She asked her philanthropist friend about the Children's Foundation that urgently needed donations, probed the journalist present about a special end-of-year story, commented, in a voice everyone could easily grasp, how symbolic it would be to announce something grand that evening. Her every sentence was a ribbon tying an inevitable box. The tension now, no longer stuck in her throat, defined its contours. Richard realized, with a minimal delay, that the house no longer simply obeyed his gesture. He smiled more, toasted more, displayed a superficial congratulations to a recently awarded businessman, and behind the smile, a calculation began to add up. As he raised his glass in an impromptu toast, the flame of a candle beside the tree tilted and spilled a drop of wax that solidified like a drop of fatigue. The drop remained there, white and definitive, marking the carpet like a comma in the middle of a sentence. The silence that followed the toast was not empty. It was a plowed field. No one noticed that Elizabeth approached Maria with a simple request about dessert. The two spoke so quietly that even the tree chose not to hear. But when they parted, there was an agreement between them that needed no words. They would protect the night from what did not belong to it. And like someone obeying the tides, the night began to turn toward the direction stories demanding justice always do. Slowly, surely, inevitably. Do you want me to continue with the next section? Leading to veiled confrontation that changes the axis of the party without anyone noticing. The room was crowded, but it seemed as if two different worlds occupied the same space. In the visible, glasses clinked in toasts, laughter spread like candlelight, and the soft music of the hired band created a flawless backdrop. In the invisible, a silent game was being played, a board game whose rules were known only to three people, Richard, Elizabeth, and Maria. Each moved their pieces with small, but intentional gestures. Richard tried to maintain control of the script. At every opportunity, he approached Maria, disguising his attempts at isolation with harmless excuses, asking to check the arrangement of the dishes, checking the wine supply, confirming details of the coffee that would be served later. But Maria, always with a polite smile, found a reason not to be alone with him. She approached other guests, called another employee for help, or simply adjusted something near her. Elizabeth observed each advance with the calm of someone who had already planned a counterattack. Her strategy wasn't to forcibly prevent Richard from acting, but to gradually undermine the terrain where he tried to plant his intentions. She would intercept him with seemingly casual conversations, introduce him to someone who required his immediate attention, or invite Maria to participate in some task alongside him. There was nothing explicit, no scene that could be interpreted as an accusation. Just a constant diversion, like a current of wind that changes a boat's course without the boat's awareness. The guests, oblivious to the silent battle, chatted about travel, business deals, and New Year's resolutions. But some began to notice a strange choreography. The wife always appeared near the maid. The husband seemed to circle the room in ever-shrinking circles, and Maria rarely came within 2 meters of Richard. It was like watching a dance without music, guided by forces that remained undisclosed. At one point, Elizabeth approached Maria with a glass of sparkling wine in hand and a warm smile. She talked about how perfect the dessert was, thanked her for her dedication, and, almost imperceptibly, positioned herself so that she blocked Richard's view. When he approached, he found not the maid alone, but the two of them side by side, chatting as if they were old acquaintances. The gleam in Elizabeth's eyes said more than any sentence. Not today. Richard, with his trained ability to mask frustration, made a general comment about how beautiful the tree was and moved on. But inside, the feeling that his control was slipping began to create small fissures. What should have been a night of mastery and satisfaction was turning into a minefield where every step seemed calculated against him. The band changed the music to something slower and more intimate, and the lighting was dimmed. It was the perfect moment for him to try again, and that's when Elizabeth made her most precise move. She invited Maria to help her show some guests a rare set of inherited family china. The display case was in the opposite corner of the room, far from where Richard was standing. The invitation, made loudly and with a tone of enthusiasm, was heard by everyone. Maria couldn't refuse and Richard couldn't deny it without appearing impolite. As they walked together to the display window, Elizabeth felt Maria's breathing still slightly accelerated. She didn't share any confidences, didn't ask any questions. She simply placed her hand on her shoulder, lightly but firmly, as if to say, "I saw it, and I won't let it happen." Richard stood alone for a moment, surrounded by guests who demanded another face from him. The public, the impeccable one. The glass in his hand was full, but he didn't drink. I watched the two women across the room and realized, perhaps for the first time, that I had lost a battle even before delivering the final blow. And in the reflection of the window between light and shadow, his image seemed smaller, as if the night itself had decided to diminish his stature. There were stories in that house that weren't in the leather albums on the library table. Before he learned to write checks with lots of zeros, Richard had learned as a boy not to take no for an answer. His father, who owned a small sawmill in rural Vermont, would often say that the world was a tough nut to crack and that real men had axes for arms and calculus for eyes. He grew up watching negotiations like one watching cockfights. There was always a winner and a loser, and compassion was a word for Christmas cards, never for contracts. When the sawmill crumbled under a crisis, his father taught the final lesson: you only don't lose when you play by the rules you write. Years later, with the mansion and the chandeliers, Richard still used that alphabet. Each favor was a letter, each act of charity a paragraph, and people were chapters that could be edited. Elizabeth wasn't born in that dictionary. She had inherited her grandmother's delicate porcelain from the South, vessels too fine for any hasty hand. As a girl, she had learned to notice the nearly invisible cracks that run through the enamel, yet still don't impede the piece's beauty. It was with this upbringing that she married Richard, believing that some men carry cracks that require patience and care, not a hammer. The first major crack in the marriage had appeared the second. Winter, when an event assistant quietly wept in the foundation hallway. Elizabeth comforted her without asking questions. By spring, the young woman's bills were paid, a night school course appeared like a miracle, and a confidentiality agreement landed on the lawyer's desk. Richard said it was the cost of efficiency. Elizabeth swallowed the word cost like one swallows ice. Another milestone 2 years later came with a newly arrived housekeeper who left the house in a hurry, packing her dignity along with simple clothes. At the time, Richard dismissed it as a scheduling conflict. The staff understood better than to understand. Elizabeth, however, kept the woman's crumpled card and a shaky note in a brown paper envelope, which read, "Thank you for listening to me." The envelope lay dormant in the back of a locked drawer, like a match saved for a blackout. It wasn't hatred, it was memory, and memory, when it finds no answer, becomes a compass. Maria had come to this story through a different door. She didn't bring the innocence of those who still believe kindness is always innocent, but neither did she bring the bitterness of those who see danger in every outstretched hand. She carried in her baggage the breath of those who cross borders and the fright of late nights when longing seems to weigh down a building. She had worked in a 24-hour diner where the manager smiled too toothily. She knew the trick of giving compliments to ask for them, of remembering favors to pin people to the wall without using her arms. When she was hired by the Whitmores, she was surprised by the warm room and the plentiful refrigerator. She assumed, as anyone would, that she had found a haven that doesn't demand the soul as a toll. Little by little, she learned to separate genuine gratitude from the invisible leash. And that night, the leash shone in the words, "away from everyone." The hidden past still had a bureaucratic side that didn't appear in the photos, but supported the house. Like Beams, the mansion had been registered years ago in a holding company that, by careful clauses in Elizabeth's mother's will, belonged mostly to her daughter. It was her family's way of protecting the estate from moral and financial storms. Richard managed, expanded, signed invitations. Elizabeth silently held the keys that no one saw. And it was because of these keys that, for months, she had been moving pieces with precision. The foundation had received an independent audit, the accounting had been reorganized, and the journalist present at that dinner, invited apparently by chance, had received weeks before a dossier with numbers and stories that begged for light, not to expose it out of revenge, but so that the future wouldn't be built on the same ground where young women leave through the back door, carrying shame and small suitcases. Richard ignored details. He thought knowing the names, smells, and preferences of donors was enough to ensure he wouldn't be surprised. He didn't notice when Elizabeth left the family law firm for another discreet and obstinate one, specializing in seemingly innocent clauses. He didn't notice when Maria, on a day off, was invited by Elizabeth herself to visit an exhibition of antique nativity scenes downtown, a simple outing that, without fanfare, tested the trust between them. He didn't notice when the house began to learn to obey a different kind of command, one that doesn't speak loudly, but doesn't back down. Behind the porcelain display case, Elizabeth told her guests about the origins of the pieces, stories of her ancestors, and trips to Charleston. As her voice glided between dates and scenes, I knew she wasn't talking about dishes, she was talking about heirlooms. Some are displayed in the center of the table, others are tucked away in the back of drawers, waiting for the moment when they cease to be secrets and become a foundation. Maria listened as if recognizing ancient accents and understood something. She hadn't been told. In that house, for the first time in a long time, there was a woman ready to pay the price of upholding the right name for things. The most important revelation from the past, however, lay neither in documents nor in confidences. It lay in the way stories repeat themselves when no one interrupts them. Elizabeth realized she held in her hands the chance to break the cycle that turned favors into shackles, and, looking at Maria, she saw herself years before, in the hallway, where a girl cried and she remained silent. She would never be silent again. Karma, which many people treat as a myth, seemed to her a simple mechanism. The world returns, in time and form, what we allow to grow. And there, among porcelain and Christmas lights, she decided what she would water from that night on. Elizabeth maintained her flawless smile as she passed from guest to guest, as if nothing had changed. But inside her, something had clicked into place with an almost cruel precision. It was as if all the fragments of years of living with Richard, all the small humiliations disguised as kindness, all the episodes muffled under the weight of silence, had finally aligned in a straight line pointing to that night. And in that instant, she knew. She would not allow another story to repeat itself under the roof that bore her name. It wasn't an impulse. Elizabeth wasn't acting out of anger, she was acting methodically. From the moment she heard the tone of Richard's voice when he spoke to Maria, her reasoning had been working like a clockwork. She weighed risks, assessed consequences, calculated the exact timing of each move. She knew that victory, to be definitive, couldn't feel like a war. It had to emerge as a natural consequence, as if the world itself were demanding its due. The first step was to move Maria to his side whenever possible. He made the young woman his makeshift assistant that evening, asking for help displaying family mementos, changing the arrangement of a flower, serving a rare dessert. Each time he called her, he saw the slight tightening of Richard's lips, a sign that he realized the game had changed, but didn't know how to respond without exposing his own intentions. The second key was in the looks. Elizabeth knew how to manipulate the room's attention. She positioned herself so that, even without saying anything, she made others aware of the closeness between her and Maria. It was a subtle gesture, a hand on the shoulder, a comment in the ear, a shared laugh that sounded too natural to be rehearsed. Soon some guests were already looking at the young woman with a newfound respect, as if her position in that house were more solid than any employment contract. The third piece was even quieter, but much more profound. While talking to the family's investor friend, she mentioned, unassumingly, how much she valued the integrity of those who worked for her. She spoke about loyalty and respect with the same naturalness as someone commenting on the weather. She didn't need to name names. The message spread like perfume in the air. Richard, for his part, began to feel trapped, untouched. He tried to regain control of the party, but every attempt to approach Maria was blocked, not by physical barriers but by unavoidable circumstances. A guest calling out to him, an unexpected toast, a detail requiring his signature. It was as if the house itself had conspired against him. Elizabeth felt with every passing minute the force of her decision. It wasn't enough to protect Maria for just that night. She needed to create an environment where gestures like Richard's wouldn't find room to flourish. The foundation, the staff, the very dynamics of the house, everything would revolve around a new axis, one she herself would control. And deep down, there was something more. By defending Mary, Elizabeth was, in a way, defending the younger version of herself, the one who, years ago, remained silent in the hallway in the face of injustice, the one who believed that enduring was a way to preserve peace. Now she knew that peace bought with silence is not peace but a debt, and debts, sooner or later, the world exacts. As she handed Maria a glass of sparkling wine and watched the young woman's fingers touch hers for a moment, Elizabeth felt karma begin to move, not like lightning, but like a tide slowly receding to gather strength. The sea was building, and when it returned, it would sweep away everything without. Roots. The night grew denser like glass thickened by the cold. The band softened the tempo. Conversations formed discreet eddies, and beneath it all, fate sharpened its edges. Richard noticed a gap when two waiters passed with opposite trays. He leaned against the sideboard, called Maria with a curt gesture, and without anyone noticing, pulled a cream-colored envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "An advance for your efforts this year," he said, his voice so low it sounded like a signature. The paper had the seductive weight of easy decisions. Maria stared at the envelope, like someone staring at a dark lake. She knows its beauty, its depth. The touch of her thumb ran over the smooth edge, a fleeting memory of a cousin's overdue rent, the English course tuition she'd postponed, the longing that comes with expensive phone calls. "Still," he breathed. "Thank you, sir. May I join the others after supper?" The phrase was as gentle as a bow and as firm as a knot. Richard backed away a millimeter. The shop window smile wavered. The envelope sat silently on the sideboard amid candlesticks and ribbons. Across the room, Elizabeth chatted with the guest journalist, the one who always had the eye of someone who collects details. They talked about philanthropy and transparency, how small towns teach us about responsibility, because every gesture has a face. Elizabeth didn't mention her husband, didn't mention the foundation, not in that way. She simply floated the idea that this Christmas she intended to give a name and protection to what sustains homes from within. The phrase fell on deaf ears. The loud-voiced investor crossed the room to ask her to explain further. The family friend, a philanthropist, approached curiously. Gradually, without fanfare, a circle formed around her, as if the house had chosen her as its center of gravity. Richard noticed the movement and, instinctively, tried to shift the axis. He raised his glass, called everyone's attention for a quick toast, thanked everyone for their presence, spoke of the year's achievements and the generosity of those present. It was a perfect speech, polished by years of practice. But something didn't fit. The last word fell to the carpet like an expensive object that couldn't find a shelf. The band fell silent for a beat, the guests clapped, and yet the room remained slightly disjointed, as if waiting for a note that never came. Elizabeth then took a step forward, not to contradict, but to complete. She also thanked him with the sweetness of someone caring for fine china and asked them to keep their glasses with them for another minute. In the invisible backstage, she had already lined up the pieces. The discreet lawyer had arrived early and left a folder in the office. The foundation coordinator, present with her badge tucked away in her purse, had been warned that there might be a technical announcement. The journalist, attentive, adjusted her cell phone to record audio, without showing the screen. Maria, uninvited, positioned herself 2 steps behind Elizabeth, as if deciding to protect without making noise. The lights dimmed a notch, the sound technician's order, following the hostess's own instructions, and the tree took center stage. "Before we move on to dessert," Elizabeth said, "I want to do something simple yet important." Richard reflexively took a half step closer, as if preparing to translate any speech on his behalf, but he stopped because the room no longer called to him. The eyes were on her. "In this house," Elizabeth continued, "there are people who sustain the days when no one is looking. Today, I want everything here, the foundation, the donations, the opportunities, to also be a safe place for those who work and those who receive." A vibration ran through the air. There were no names, accusations, or spectacles. There was direction. The journalist inclined her head. The investor remained silent. Richard, still with his glass raised, made to intervene, but the piano music filled the gap with a long, clean note. On the sideboard, the edge of the envelope gleamed. Maria saw the reflection and understood, with the clarity of someone reading the sky before the snow. The time had come when things change hands. The clock struck midnight with a low pre-echo, the kind of sound that imbues the room with gravity. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with the foundation coordinator, who nodded almost invisibly. The blow to come would have neither screams nor cracks. It would be a signature and an announcement. But before it there was one final thread to be pulled. "And to begin," said Elizabeth, turning to Maria with a caress that didn't ask for permission, "I want everyone to know the story of the one who keeps this place breathing." The circle closed. The room held its breath. Richard, for the first time that night, couldn't find the exact place for his hand, and the tree, as if understanding, turned on all its lamps in the same second, shedding light on the envelope that hadn't changed hands, and on the choices that from then on would change direction. The air in the room seemed thicker as Elizabeth took 2 steps forward, positioning herself beneath the central chandelier. The music stopped unhurriedly, as if even the piano wanted to listen. Glass still in hand, she looked up at the guests and let a brief silence stretch, long enough for everyone to sense that something important was about to happen. "Here," he began, "I don't want to talk just about numbers, goals, or apparent victories. I want to talk about values, those that aren't displayed in balance sheets, but underpin every gesture that keeps us standing." As she spoke, Elizabeth's eyes swept the room, occasionally lingering on strategic faces. The attentive journalist, the furrowed-browed investor, the foundation coordinator with a slight smile of agreement. "From today on, every project that comes out of this house will have a clear clause. No collaborator, partner, or beneficiary will be placed in a position of discomfort or pressure to serve personal interests. And, what's more," she paused carefully, "this clause extends to our home, to everyone who lives and works here." It was at that moment that the coup truly began to take shape. The foundation coordinator, previously warned, discreetly removed a document from the folder left in the office. She approached and handed it to Elizabeth, who took it leisurely. "Here is the new policy registered and ready for signature, and we will do it now in front of everyone." The words fell like a bell, clear, irreversible. Richard, motionless, tried to mask the tension with a smile, but the color in his face betrayed the impact. He knew that by signing there in public, he would not only be formally bound by that commitment, but also limited in what he valued most: silent control over others. And refusing would be even worse. It would expose himself as an obstacle to something that seemed morally unquestionable. Elizabeth then turned to Maria. "You represent the most valuable thing this house holds: trust. I want you here by my side when we sign." Maria hesitated for a second, surprised, but approached under everyone's watchful eye. The document was open on the central table, flanked by 2 pens. The entire room leaned forward slightly, as if trying to get a better look. Elizabeth signed first, with a confident stroke. She passed the pen to Richard, took it as if carrying a weight heavier than it appears. For a moment, he seemed to be searching for an exit, but every doorway was occupied by waiting faces. The journalist held her cell phone, the investor crossed his arms, and even the band watched in silence. He signed. No speeches, no reply, just the trace of the pen tearing the paper. When she finished, Elizabeth collected the document and held it up slightly. "Now it's official. This house belongs to the integrity it deserves." There was a spontaneous applause, brief but meaningful. Mary took a step back, not out of discomfort, but to make it clear that she didn't need to be the center of attention to have earned what was hers: respect. Richard, the glass still intact in his hand, took a long sip, but the taste of the wine seemed metallic. Karma hadn't screamed, but it had settled in. It was there, in the signature, in the people's eyes, in the subtle loss of territory he would never regain. Dinner continued, the music returned, the conversations drifted away. But for him, the night had already changed hands. On the sideboard, the envelope remained in the same place, now irrelevant. A silent witness to a victory that didn't need to be celebrated out loud. And in the reflection of the window, Richard noticed something he never thought he'd see. His own image, dwarfed by the weight of a piece of paper that, to everyone else, seemed merely a formality, but which, to him, was the verdict. The dinner ended, as if it were just another Christmas, but a new order was circulating invisibly through the house. Conversations gradually dissolved into warm goodbyes, coats retrieved from the coat rack, and a chilly breeze that blew in every time the front door opened. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering footprints almost as soon as they were made, as if winter itself wanted to erase the traces of that night. Richard maintained his composure until the end, hugging guests, thanking them for gifts, smiling for photos he might hate to see later. But when the last laugh faded into the hallway and the door closed, he stood in the foyer, staring at the illuminated tree as if trying to decipher something that had escaped his control. The cream-colored envelope still sat on the sideboard, untouched. He walked over, picked it up, and for a moment considered putting it in his pocket. But something about the weight of the paper felt different, colder, more useless. Without much thought, he set it back. Elizabeth entered the room unhurriedly, with the serenity of someone who knows she doesn't need to say anything for her message to be heard. She walked past the tree, arranged an ornament, and without looking directly at her husband, simply commented, "It's curious how some things lose value when they don't find the right owner." She continued walking to the kitchen, where Maria was discreetly collecting the last trays. Maria, seeing Elizabeth, smiled in silent recognition. There were no hugs, no words of thanks. Just a brief exchange of glances that said, "It is done." The young woman carefully put the porcelain away again, while Elizabeth watched her for a moment, as if contemplating something she had helped preserve. In the corner of the room, the fireplace was consuming its last embers. One, more resilient, still burned, but slowly turned to ash. Richard, alone, watched this small flame die, and couldn't help but feel as if he were witnessing a cruel metaphor. The heat, he thought he controlled, had been extinguished without noise, without drama, simply by a lack of fuel. When everyone had left, the mansion fell silent. Outside, the wind dragged the snow against the windows. Inside, the tree remained lit, casting its light over the abandoned envelope. And it was in this light that Richard realized it wasn't the paper that was out of place. It was him. The house, which for years he had shaped to his whims, now followed a rhythm that no longer belonged to him. Upstairs, Elizabeth turned off the bedroom light, and before going to sleep opened the drawer where she kept the old envelope, the one with the thank-you note from her former employee. She placed it on the nightstand, next to a fresh flower arrangement. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the exact point where stories take a different turn. The next day, when Richard woke up, he found the cream-colored envelope on the coffee table, with his name written on it. Inside was no money, but a single sheet of paper, a copy of the terms of reference he had signed the night before, his signature highlighted in blue ink. There were no notes, no comments, just the document. Outside, the sun reflected off the snow, making everything brighter than he would have liked, and it was in this white silence that he understood once and for all that karma didn't need to be loud to be definitive. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Comment below what you would do if you were in Elizabeth's shoes, and get ready because in the next video, another story will show that fate always knows when it's time to give back what was taken,